And welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and here to answer your questions tonight, Catholic commentator and writer Monica Doumit. Outspoken Anglican priest Rod Bauer, whose church billboards have been a viral media sensation. Retired Australian General Jim Molan, who's now a Liberal senator. The former president of the ACTU and new member for Batman, Jed Kearney. And the founder and CEO of gig economy website Airtasker, Tim Fung. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV and iView and News Radio, but not at this stage on News 24. Our first question tonight comes from Kim Jenkins.
My dad, Tony Jenkins, was a paramedic in Newcastle for 28 years, and a little over a month ago he took his own life while at work. We understand now that Dad was using fentanyl at work to cope with the stress of on-the-job trauma as well as assault. Now, we understand that we don't send soldiers to war for 28 years because of the PTSD that would cause. So when are we going to start looking after our paramedics as well as our first responders? And shouldn't New South Wales Ambulance lead the way in terms of the care and support that these ambulance officers need?
Kim, we'll come back to you in a minute, but first let's hear from some of the panellists. And Rod, I'll start with you because I think you know quite a few ambulance men and women over the years.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your question, Kim. My heart goes out to you and your family for the trauma that you've been through. It's really quite awful. I spend a lot of time in emergency departments waiting for families to turn up, and often I'm just standing there talking to the ambos, and I hear a lot of their stories there. And these ambos really care. I often see them sort of come back in on their next shift just to see how that patient got on. And so they're really connected. Sometimes they spend hours and hours and hours just standing beside the gurney waiting in triage, and so they get to know patients really well. And sometimes the outcomes aren't what we might desire. And so there's a lot of trauma. Of course, increasingly ambulance officers are being attacked doing their jobs. And of course, PTSD, and Jim would know more about this in terms of soldiers than I would, but and so certainly we have some traumatised people out there who are out there on the line helping us, and so obviously greater drug control protocols are really important here, and I understand that's being taken care of, but even more, that really high-class professional care for our ambulance officers is really what's needed now, and so there's got to be a lot of thought and a lot of money put into that so that we don't see other families going through the trauma that you guys have been through.
Just before I go to the other panellists, Kim, can I just come back to you? And first of all, I think it's extremely brave of you to be here, so thanks for that, because it's a very important subject. But what do you think could have helped your dad so that we've got something concrete to talk about?
I completely agree that the drug regulation is an issue, but we wouldn't need to look so far into how the drugs are controlled if paramedics and other first responders weren't tempted to use them. So I think we need to look less at how we can prevent them from taking the drugs and more as to why are they trying to take them. And that comes down to them not being supported properly on the job, not being given the opportunity to properly seek out help in a way that they don't feel ashamed. And I suppose onto that point, we need to build that culture that it is acceptable for these men and women to get help, and that comes from management, and it's not being done at the moment.
Can you just tell us what you found in your dad's locker when you went in there after his death?
We found huge amounts of correspondence between my dad and various members of the New South Wales Ambulance Management, correspondences that were complaints that my dad had made, saying that the men and women out there were having trouble because of this and this and this and this, and that it needed to change. Most of them were from my dad saying that he'd gotten no response, or that the response he was given wasn't adequate enough, as well as suggestions that he'd made. One of the ones that comes to mind is that he suggested that they need more information before they go to a job. One of the biggest stresses we've heard is that these paramedics have no idea what they're going to. and it's one of the biggest anxiety.
Yes.
Because they could be going to deliver a baby or something wonderful, or they could be walking into a home where there's a man waiting with a serrated knife, which was the incident that my dad went to.
Kim, I'll give you a bit of a rest for a minute while we hear some of the panel respond to what is a truly terrible story. Jim, you've obviously seen PTSD in the Army. Imagine guys who go out on operations in the Army. It's a limited time. They see terrible things. But imagine this every day of your life, or every week at least, for 28 years.
No, and I think that's exactly right. And Kim, I think your view of the support that is needed is just so important. And I think so much of it must come from the top. There's no two ways about it. And the Australian Defence Force has made errors over many, many decades in not doing it, but I think they do it much, much better now than they have in the past. I think that we may be a long way ahead of where the AMBOs and the police are, which is a good thing. But I have to say that some of the trauma that the AMBOs see and that police see and that they live with for a long period of time is pretty horrendous, and it must wear you down. I guess some of the trauma that we see of particularly the Special Forces and some of our combat soldiers, combat engineers have seen over the last operations we've been involved in over the last few decades have been sustained and have been pretty awful. So I guess we've got a feel for it. What I have personally found is that the level of trauma that we suffer is, particularly suicides, are lower than society's averages whilst our soldiers are serving. Whilst they've got their mates around them, they're in structures and people are talking to them and helping them. When they leave, it goes up a bit and approaches society's levels. But you are so right. And I would be astonished, I must admit, if the ambulance service wasn't working itself to try and stop this.
I'll go to Jed Kearney. You heard the story there. I mean, a series of written complaints not responded to, according to the family. That's a shocking notion that people could be seeing these dreadful things and getting traumatised and not getting any response.
I think it is shocking, absolutely. And as an employer, you have a responsibility, and not only for the physical well-being, but also the mental well-being of your employees, and they should have been responded to. As you may or may not know, but I was a nurse for many, many years, and I saw very similar things in the nursing profession, trauma and depression and drug use. I was in Victoria, and we were able to set up for nurses a very specific health service that assisted nurses when they went down this path, and you were able to intervene early, and a lot of the time you could get people back to work and healthy. So that's a very simple thing that I think you could do. They could leave the workplace and confidentially go and get help there, if it was drug abuse or mental health.
It doesn't surprise you to hear that someone facing these kind of traumas could be self-medicating.
Oh, not at all.
Something like fentanyl, which is an extremely dangerous drug.
Not at all. It doesn't. I think it's quite common, more common than we probably know. I think the second thing is the stigma of mental health generally, particularly with men. You know, they're less likely to speak up about it, and I think there's a lot of work still. I know we talk about removing the stigma of mental health, but there's still a lot of work to be done to help people actually talk about it and get help. I think that's really important. And the third thing, I think, is that generally we need to invest more in mental health. There needs to be more money goes into the system, there needs to be more support, and we need people to feel that they can go and get it when they need it. And that's something that I would be committed to seeing.
Tim, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think that AMBOs are absolute heroes, in my opinion. That kind of work is incredibly difficult work to do. And I think one thing that I would say is that I really agree with Jed that employers really do have that responsibility to ensure that that communication is fostered and there's opportunities for people to actually talk about some of these mental health issues. So one thing I think is really important is that that employers do create the programs that are required to make sure that people are able to be heard. But I also think it's really important that we actually address the key issue here. And the issue is, I believe, that people need to be able to know that it's okay to come out and talk about these issues. So once again, I think that people really do matter in this scenario, and we often label it as a job, ambulance, police, or soldier. And I think in this case, we've got to really look at the actual people, the individual people, do everything that we can do to be receptive to when they want to talk about these issues.
Can I just add one quick thing? I do know, I agree with you. In Victoria, just recently, there was a big campaign by the ambulance services. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Actually spoke about it because my dad's name is Tony and it's called Operation Tone. We almost felt like it was meant to be, that we would find it and see how we wanted change to be made in New South Wales.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic that you knew about that, because the state Labor government, the Victorian government has responded very well to that and have said that they will get to work immediately and to see what needs to be done. So don't stop talking about it, and I really encourage you to really, make things happen. So congratulations.
Kim, is it your view that New South Wales are not moving in that direction?
I agree.
I don't know. I'm asking you. You think that's the case?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Everything that we've seen, everything that we had heard from my dad and his friends gave us that opinion before, and I suppose what we've been met with since my father's death, and in discussions with the huge amount of people who've contacted us, we really think they have a huge job to do.
I'll hear from our final panellist, Monica. I'm sorry, you've been listening quietly on the end here.
Well, all great contributions, Kim. First of all, just so sorry for your loss, for your family's loss. We all owe a great deal to our AMBOs and to all of our first responders, and it just breaks my heart to hear your story. In picking up what the other panellists have said, I think probably what's really important is that, the heads of the ambulance services get in touch and connect with people in the ADF and things like that, and learn from their experience and what happened, because our AMBOs are there for us, and we shouldn't be leaving the people who bear a lot of our burdens alone bearing theirs.
I'm just going to give Kim the final word before we move on. And what's the main thing that your family would like to see to have come out of this terrible tragedy?
We want to see an overhaul in the mental health support that ambulance officers receive. They shouldn't have to ask for help. There should be no question that they receive help, whether they like it or not.
Kim, thanks for putting it so succinctly. Now, if any of you found this discussion distressing in any way, you can call Lifeline on 131114. We're going to change subjects now. The next question is from Jan Kimovec. Go ahead, Jan.
I'd like to ask Father Bauer a question. The Bible clearly states in Corinthians, "Do not be deceived. Do you know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites will inherit the kingdom of God." And Jesus also teaches in Matthew that marriage is between a man and a woman. How do you reconcile what the Bible, the Word of God, clearly teaches with your own personal belief?
Thank you for the question, Jan. It's a really important one. And I think the question really is a question of biblical interpretation and biblical scholarship. And my feeling is the core of your question is probably about the homosexuality issue. And of course, homosexuality is a concept that's a very recent one. It's the only one that has been available to us since probably the late 19th century into the 20th century. So when biblical writers are talking about these issues, you can't really translate that word that you've translated as homosexual. That's not a concept that's available to the writer. The only concept of human sexuality that's available to biblical writers is what we would call heterosexuality, the opposite sex attraction. They are aware, of course, that there is behaviour that they believe is deviant to that, but what they don't know, that there is something that exists called same-sex attraction, and so it's not biblically fair from a scholar's point of view to look at that as homosexuality. What the Bible is really saying, if anything, is that heterosexual people shouldn't have gay sex, and I'm okay with that. I mean, that's fine, but we can't impose a 20th century psychological concept onto writers that had no idea that same-sex attraction was actually a thing.
Now, Monica, I'll bring you in, and
Sure.
you're obviously a senior figure in the Catholic Church and a senior figure in the anti-same-sex marriage debate that we've recently had in this country. But I'll just, in order to kind of make the question more pointy for you, I'd like to point out what the Pope said recently to a gay man. He said, "God made you this way." So how do you respond to the Pope's idea of homosexuality?
What a great question. Well, the only side of what we're getting from the Pope and from the Pope's question is from the person who is reporting at the Vatican at the moment, is saying nothing. But we'll...
The Pope's been misquoted.
But no, I'm just saying
I haven't
that...
heard him claiming this is fake news.
Well, look, the thing is that we all have desires and attractions that we have to deal with in our daily lives. And with what Father Rod was saying, whether or not they knew of homosexuality back in ancient Greek times, whether or not they named it as such is a different question. But I guess to your point, obviously, from my perspective, the Catholic Church is very clear on this, and it's not only a matter for us of biblical interpretation, but we also follow what the official teaching of the Church is. And,
is the Pope changing that as you speak?
No, he's not changing that as we speak. The Pope can't. The Pope can only teach what is within the realms of the Catholic faith, and that includes that marriage is between a man and a woman.
It brings up, and there's echoes in the question actually, of the famous Israel Folau tweets, the rugby footballer, and it seems the rugby union authorities have decided to let that one go through to the keeper and to essentially make the argument that his right to free speech should not be impinged. So is that... I know that there's a whole religious freedom debate going on at the moment. So do you see this connected to that in any way? Because his essential argument was all homosexuals will go to hell. That's what he said in his tweet. Now, it hurt a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But the rugby union decided, well, we're not going to act.
Yeah, well, I think that was a wise move from rugby union. In terms of Israel Folau's comment, if anybody was to ask me what God's plan for gay people was, I promise you that the first word out of my mouth wouldn't be hell. God's plan for gay people is what it is for me, which is to, love and serve him in this life so as to live with him in eternity. But in terms of the rugby union not acting against Folau, I think that that's a really good idea, because what happens, particularly we saw the threats of sponsorship withdrawal and things like that. Mm. If people are able to withdraw sponsorship in order to dictate what somebody says, then what we get is in a situation where the people with the money make the rules. And I don't think that any of us want to be in a situation where the people with the most money and the most sponsorship money get to dictate what we say, whatever our opinions are.
Monica, I'm just going to go back to our question. Jan, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to clarify what Israel Folau said. He said they would go to hell unless they repent, which means they turned away from their way of thinking. And you didn't answer my question. I'm sorry.
Who are you talking about?
Father Bauer. You didn't answer my question. What's your personal belief?
Oh, my personal belief in terms of gay and lesbian people. They are loved by God. They are worthy of love from everybody, and that's my personal belief. Mm-hmm.
But do you agree with same-sex marriage?
Absolutely, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I mean, what I campaigned for in Australia was civil marriage for same-sex people.
Oh, okay.
The question is, can we translate that into, in sense, from the Anglican Church? Do I believe that I should marry people? My church at the moment says no. We will be discussing this for probably another 20 or 30 years, and I want to be part of that conversation. I want to listen to what other scholars have to say. I want to have my input. My inclination is that we probably should find a way to at least acknowledge or bless same-sex marriages or same-sex unions, but that's a conversation that we will have in our church for some time to come. That's one I really want to be part of.
Okay, we're going to come back to the freedom of religion question a bit later. Let's move on. We've got another question. We've got another question. This one's from Marie Austin. Hello, Marie.
Hi. I've come here tonight from Billawheeler in central Queensland. As you would be aware, on the 5th of March at dawn, Mr Dutton's Border Force removed our friends Priya and Nardis and their 2 Australian-born daughters from their home. They have been since held in a Melbourne detention centre for what is now 84 days. Our town love this little family and we want them. We want them to come home. I personally have travelled, along with other people from Billawheeler, the 1,800 kilometres to Melbourne to visit and support this family in whatever way we can. There has been the questions asked of Mr Dutton to exercise his discretionary powers to allow these people to stay, and a petition with 100,000 signatures has also been presented calling for their return to Billawheeler. I guess our question tonight is, what more could we do to ensure that Priya, Nardis, Kopika and Thanika return home to Billawheeler?
Jim, I'll start with you. It's a tough one. Minister Dutton seems to have made a decision. He seems entrenched in his decision so far. Do you think he should reconsider?
Well, I don't know the full details of the case. I've heard discussion of it through the media. I guess and they sound like a lovely family, and God bless you for looking after them, because the migrants that come to our country and particularly move into small country towns are worth their weight in gold. And we've got to support them, so thank you for supporting them. I don't know what Peter Dutton has done. I happen to have great faith in Peter Dutton. And there you are. I happen to have great faith in Peter Dutton. He will not act. You put your case to him and let's see what he does. And I hope that your good family comes back, if there is no technical issues, that they come back to Billawheeler.
Should it count for anything in Peter Dutton's mind and in your mind, actually, because we're really asking for your opinion here, when the people of a township have made their assessment of the character of the people that have been taken away from them?
Without doubt. It all goes to character, and I've heard Peter Dutton speak often about character. He has cancelled visas on a number of occasions on the basis of character, and everyone I've looked at looks like they deserved it. So put your case to him. He is a man that I believe in, a man who I think will do well when he looks at the case. I don't know the details of the case.
I'm just going to go back, Jim, I'll go back to our question, because she surely does know more about the case. And can you tell us, is the town sort of united on this, on the assessment of the character of this family?
Yeah, it appears that the town is united on this. There's quite a strong support network to work to bring this family home. I know there are fears with other people that feel that refugees coming into our country are draining our welfare system. This family was working. Now, other people might say they're taking our Australian jobs. This man was working in a small rural community doing a job that not a lot of other people want to do. So the work that they are doing is valued. They're valued and contributing members of our community. We have presented the case to Mr Dutton, and so we're not really getting a response.
But Jim, how about this, Jim? Would you be prepared to talk to these guys? And, and perhaps if you are convinced, you could put the case to Peter Dutton, because clearly you've got some connections there.
I'm not yet. Absolutely. I'm not yet convinced, because I don't know. There must be some technical reason as to why these good people were taken away. I'd be very interested in that. I'm very happy to do that. Very happy to do that.
We can arrange that. Marie, technical reason?
Well, I was just going to say, I guess the standard response that we're hearing is that after investigation they don't meet Australia's protection obligations. But at the same time, this family have been allowed to live in Australia and in our community for many years on visas that have been extended while this case is being investigated.
I'll just interrupt for one moment, because your neighbour is sitting next to you there, and I guess you've come from Billawheeler as well.
Yes.
You wanted to say something.
I was just going to reiterate what Maria was saying just then. This family has been allowed to move into Biloela and start a life there. Nadis has been working the whole time. He's been working jobs, pushing trolleys. He's been working at the meatworks, the abattoirs where he is now. He's been volunteering his time because belonging to the community is such a precious thing to him. They've got 2 Australian-born children. Mr Dutton does say that they don't meet the criteria. However, I feel that having been in Biloela and allowed to live a free and safe life, now being taken with their children and placed in detention, to me that's just another form of passive torture that these people have to live with every day.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from the other panellists. Jed Kearney.
It is difficult to... I don't want to muck up anything in their case because I know it's very important to you, so I'm going to try not to sort of mention anything specifically. I don't know really how these things work, but it is wonderful to see a whole community come behind this issue, and it gives faith to a lot of us that there's a lot of warmth and acceptance in Australia when often we hear, as you said before, we hear the opposite. And so it's really wonderful, and congratulations. And I think it seems to me that you're doing everything that you can. You've travelled all the way down here. You've come on Q&A. That's pretty scary. And sat in the front row, and you've confronted Mr Molan, Senator Molan.
Oh, they haven't confronted me.
Well, you know,
politely.
Senator Molan has actually agreed to listen to them.
It was going to say, which is great. And so I think you're doing okay there.
Tim, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think it's awesome that people are connecting in the local community and actually forming these relationships, and I think that's a really, really amazing thing. It's a really positive thing, and I think actually when you look at these interpersonal relationships that form in local communities, I think this is a really positive sign that those are still existent and still real. I think the case, around refugees is something that's really complex, but I do think that overarchingly, we've got to start thinking about things at a more global level. People are people, and it's really important to be protecting Australians and protecting Australian jobs, and that's something that we're very much passionate about, creating and securing jobs for Australians. I do think that we have to look at things on a more global scale. People are people.
Monica.
Well, look, my wonderful father and all of my grandparents came to Australia on a boat from the Middle East. And so I am loath to tell anybody else that they cannot come here and enjoy the amazing opportunities that this country has to offer. While I don't know the specifics of your friend's case, that is what I would want for them, and I guess for anybody who's genuinely seeking to come here. I know how much my family benefited from the community that gathered around them when they arrived. And so, good luck to you in your pursuit.
Rod.
What we do know, of course, is how long have Priya and Nadis and their children been in detention now?
84 days.
84 days. So one of the things we actually do know, and I don't know them, I've never met them, but I do know that their mental health will now be affected. Their mental health will start to deteriorate, and especially the kids. These kids are now, for 84 days, been in prison, surrounded by all sorts of other people that you probably wouldn't necessarily want your kids around. So that's the first thing. So my question, I guess, that goes with your question is how did we get to this place? How do we get to a point where we're raiding family homes at 5 o'clock in the morning in the most terrifying way, separating a family, dragging them off into detention? There is no reason that anyone seems to be aware of that this can't be processed in the community. I'd like just for a moment to explore something in the bigger picture, though, and the reason why...
the bigger picture we might get to in the next question. So, and Jim just wanted a quick response.
And I was going to say, I'd love to talk to you about it, and I guess we've got to allocate some credibility to whatever did cause them to be raided and taken away, and that's got to be a factor in what we do, but let's see what we can do.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, our next question, it's on a similar subject. It's a video from Gabby Sutherland, a former teacher at the Refugee Detention Centre on Nauru.
Minister Dutton has repeatedly said that he has released every child out of detention. Well, here is a photo taken yesterday of just some of the more than 120 children, my former students on Nauru, who have been detained in the open-air prison on the tiny Pacific island for 5 years now. When is the government going to stop lying and admit that these children on the screen exist and they deserve freedom and a chance for a normal childhood?
This remains a highly political question. I'm going to start with the politicians. Jed Kearney.
I think they should own up to the fact that there are children there. Absolutely. Just to consistently say that they're not there, clearly that is not true. And I think it is distressing, and indefinite detention is an appalling policy. And for people to be retained without any hope of ever knowing when they are going to move into safety is appalling, and it shouldn't happen.
So here's an obvious question for you, and inevitably for the Labor Party, if they ever come to government, should those children be brought to Australia?
Look, I think that we would hope that we could get them off those islands as quickly as possible. People off Manus, off Nauru, and settled as quickly as possible. And I'm sure that that would be the intention of a Labor government. But can I talk a little bit more broadly about asylum seeker policy? Because
you're not saying specifically, not saying Australia.
Well, not at this point, because this is what I want to talk about. Because I think you alluded to this. We have at the moment a government that drives an agenda, I think, of hate and fear. And my first thought, sorry, Jim, would be to get rid of the government with regards to this. Secondly, I think there are people with real fears, and you alluded to this before. There are people that have anxieties, that they are angry for whatever reason, and they can't see that bringing refugees here help them. People say to me, when I talk about refugees, they say, yes, but the schools are full, the hospitals are falling apart, there's one road to town, it takes me 4 hours to get to work, rents are high, my kid has never worked, I'm in insecure work. These are real fears and real anxieties, and they make people angry. Or they say to me, I've been trying to get my brother here from India on family reunion visa for 5 years. Why should I let someone come on a boat? They're hard questions, and they're hard things to deal with. And I think we have to acknowledge that those things are real and we have to deal with them. That's the first thing. Secondly, and I know I'm taking a bit long here, Tony, but secondly, I think what you referred to is that we have to act as global citizens, Tim. We have to increase our intake, and Labor is looking at increasing our asylum seeker intake. Bill Shorten says he doesn't want people to get on boats. OK, what can we do to find other pathways? In the 1970s, Malcolm Fraser did assessments in the country of conflict, and 177,000 people came here. Most of them came on jets, on aeroplanes, and they came straight into the community. And, I think we really need to look at that. We need to look at the UNHCR and fund them properly to make sure they can do those assessments in places of transit and in places of conflict.
Okay.
One last thing. All right. Those in favour of me going on, say aye. Aye. Those against, nay. The ayes have it.
Okay.
Just very quickly, I promise. The third thing...
Oh, come on.
No, it's true, I know. The third thing is... we have to talk, when we do have asylum seekers here, when we do have asylum seekers here, they need to be treated with respect. These are robust, resilient, courageous people, and they need respect.
Jed, I know I gave you extra time, and you still haven't answered the question, should those kids come to Australia?
Because this is the problem.
Should they or not?
Because we deal with this in binaries. And it is about, Jim loves it when we argue about things like that because he gets all warm and fuzzy inside. Peter Dutton loves it too because he knows that will be the story and not that he is being punitive and awful. And there will be another 3 years of Peter Dutton as an immigration minister, and I couldn't stand it.
OK, so you just can't...
we have to be careful.
You can't answer that question for fear of the political consequences.
I think we have to see it as a political situation, unfortunately. And the last thing, though... People need to have rights.
Jed, I'm going to go to Jim now.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you very much for that. I think you have totally misrepresented, I'm afraid, the situation that we have on Nauru. Every child out of detention, those children are not detained on that island. Their parents made the decision to go there. And if you're... and I don't know, Gabby was a video, wasn't she? So if you are saying that we are not acknowledging that the children are there, that is just plainly ridiculous, I'm afraid. Of course we acknowledge the children are there.
So, Jim, she referred to it as an open-air prison. You would agree that children cannot leave the island?
Of course they can't leave the island unless their parents decide to go home.
Right.
And we would be very happy. You know, it is a total misrepresentation. We don't look at it in binaries. I don't see that refugees, of which we bring in about 18 to 20,000 into this country per year, are the source of the kind of problems of roads and houses. Other things may be, but not refugees. None of us. I have never met anyone in the organisation which is said, who has said, let's keep them on Manus and Nauru forever. Let's have an open-ended detention. Never have I met one person. Who started this? Rudd Gillard started it. Who keeps them there? Naive activists. What are we doing? We have been able to move, oh well, good on you, but we have been able to move 1,250 off. That's exactly what all of you, I hope, would join with us in doing. The Americans will take 1,250, we hope. Some have gone to Cambodia, a very small number. Some have gone to Canada. I have never met anyone in the government or in the bureaucracy that has said, let's keep them there. That is a total misrepresentation of the facts.
Let's hear from other panellists. Rod.
There's 137 children on Nauru at the moment. There's about 1,600 people in offshore detention. Their mental health is deteriorating in awful ways. I've been in the people business for 30 years, and I've sat with people with suicidal ideation. I've caught glimpses of desperation and depression and hopelessness. But I've never encountered the type of hopelessness I encounter in these human beings. It's a different type of hopelessness. I've sat with people who have felt that if they took their own lives, that their souls would be free. But what I'm hearing from these people is my soul is already dead, and I'm just waiting for my body to die. I had a message from a man on Manus the other day, and I'll quote him. He said, this island is cursed, and we will all die one by one. This was after the death of Salim the other day. And so the question I would want to explore is, you know, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where we are?
That's an obvious answer to
well,
that.
no, Jim, it's not obvious.
There is an obvious answer.
No, well, if you let me have... Okay, you've had your go.
Policy.
You've had your go.
Sure.
Let me have a go.
Go.
The reason we've got to the point where we are dragging people out of their homes at 5 o'clock in the morning, where we are incarcerating children on islands, is that somehow or other we've given our politicians the message that there's power in fear. And that we can use fear, and we can use fear to manipulate people, and we don't give them enough information, and there's power in fear.
OK, Rod, I'm going to pause you there because Jim does get a right to respond to that. He should have a right to respond to it.
As long as I get a chance to finish.
No, good.
We've got to hear from other panellists as well.
I go back to the start of all of this. We have solved this program and this problem in the coalition area a number of times. Whenever we hand over to Labor, they unsolve it. And it was unsolved by the Rudd government. It was unsolved on the basis that when the election was running, Opposition Leader Rudd said that he would maintain the policy. He did not maintain the policy, and 1,200 people died. People who advocate moving of those people back from the islands back to Australia must realise that there is a consequence, and they must accept that consequence could be death.
Can I just ask you the obvious question that stems from that? Are these children and their parents, are they being kept in order to be an example to others?
No, they're not.
Because that seemed to be what you're saying. If you take them out, the others will come.
No. What we're trying to do, we take them out every single day. They're going out of the islands every single day. 32 have gone home this year. They've gone home this year.
Now that must 32 out of 1,600?
Yes, 32 out of 1,600. And one of the reasons why many of the others don't go home is because naive activists are encouraging them to stay. Now that's a decision that they make. And very good people, and I'm sure Father Rod's a great person, very good people, I think, have got to accept the consequences that in their naivety they could start this again, and another 1,200
Okay,
people.
I'm going to pause just to ask the audience to treat all of our panellists with respect. They have points to make, and a lot of people in the country are listening to them, not just the ones in this room. Monica.
Look, you asked me before about things that Pope Francis says, and one of the things he reminds us about refugees is primarily they're not a problem to be solved, but they are human beings, our brothers and sisters, and sometimes we lose that in this debate about the refugee problem and about different government policies and opposition policies. These are people who are on Nauru. It is not an ideal situation, and look, the whys and wherefores of immigration policy are a little bit beyond my pay grade, but we need to ensure that people are given a sense of finality in their journey, that they aren't held in sort of this indefinite limbo, and while they're waiting, that they're treated with some dignity and some freedom.
Okay, Tim, you've been listening to this, and I mean, the notion that people could be held indefinitely, or at least until they make the decision to go back to the countries that they came from, that's the one, I guess, that's now being raised.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I think that any sort of punitive measures that are being taken against these people seems to be absolutely abhorrent if that's what's actually happening. As a fourth-generation Australian, I think that we have a lot to share with the world. And if I think about, I guess, all of these issues at a global level, I actually think that Australians have a lot to share. And when we talked about, our road being blocked versus some of the things that these people are facing in the countries which they're fleeing from, I think we've really got to take a global look at that and think about what's right to do as a global community.
Okay, we're going to move on. This is a question on the same subject. I'll just take it to the politicians, though. It's from Kirk Colmeyer.
Yeah, the federal ALP has done a very good job at being able to keep a lid on internal debate on a whole range of issues, one of which is refugee policy as well. My question is, how long can the pressure cooker lid be kept on before it bursts open? And if, as polls suggest, the ALP is going to be in power from the next election, will we see a plethora of cracks in the future government, much along the lines that we've seen in federal governments for the last 10 years?
Can I just briefly, do you mean cracks to open up?
Cracks, factions, issues where like...
Over border protection?
Over border protection, or over a whole lot of other different issues, because, there's obviously, Bill Shorten has been very good at being able to keep a lid on discussion on a whole lot of different issues, unlike the Liberal Party, which kind of festers every day.
All right, let's go to Jed Kearney. Jed, I mean, it's a relevant question for you because you've now been held up as one of the cracks in the asylum seeker policy. Labor's asylum seeker policy is cracking, and you're one of the reasons the government is putting forward that it's cracking because you've said permanent detention is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are cracks. I mean, Bill Shorten himself has said quite clearly, sure, he doesn't want people getting on boats, but indefinite detention is wrong and shouldn't happen. And I actually double-checked that and had a conversation with him tonight, and he does believe that for all the obvious reasons that we all know. And I'm not quite sure why you say we're good at covering it up because, we were going to have National Conference on the 28th of August.
Is that now going to be postponed until after the election?
28th of July, rather.
Yes. We know why, because of the by-elections.
Yes.
That's not going to happen, but will the conference now be postponed until after the election, thus postponing a possibly bitter argument in the party?
Oh, I don't know, and I'm pretty sure that was never, ever the case. In fact, I think, Bill Shorten said today that we should have it before the election, or somebody said that today, but I don't know when it's going to be. I mean, it's a big thing to organise 2,000 people. We've had to cancel one in Adelaide. It's going to be a big thing to reorganise, and there will be debates on all sorts of things. And, we actually, unlike many of the other political parties, we have our debates televised on television for those who want to sit through it and suffer through 3 days of ALP conference. You're very welcome to do it, and you can see everybody's positions. From there, you can listen to all of the debates.
Does it worry you that asylum seeker policy, which had seemed dormant for some time, now looks like it's going to be one of the issues played out in the by-elections?
I think we're going to come to a good place for asylum seekers. you know, I'm not in a position to discuss what we're going to say at conference. But what I was going to say, if I had finished before, even though the ayes had it, you know, we're coming from a premise, and I want to bring the whole debate from the premise of respect, dignity and safety. And if we apply those three things to our asylum seeker policy, then I think we're a long way to getting a more humane policy.
Jim? Well, we did have, I think, some kind of conference in Victoria, Jed. I think that occurred today, and I think the CFMMEU closed it down.
Yesterday.
Yesterday, was it? Thank you. But I read Frank Brennan in the Eureka magazine this morning, and I do that on a regular basis. And Frank actually pointed out that the reason that the Labor Party is saying that they so enthusiastically support the government's border control policy is for the simple reason that they know they won't get into power unless they support that. Now, what does that mean? The ayes had it. Jed threw up something and she immediately counted everyone in this room, and the ayes had it. Well, it would appear that our border control policy is in fact supported by the wider population. Good Australians are always worried about Manus and Nauru, but the border control policy itself is consistently
Jim, I'm just going to make one obvious point, is we did not count the people in this room.
No, of course we didn't.
We didn't have a vote.
Of course we didn't.
And we're not going to have a vote.
Of course we won't.
You heard a few voices and that was it.
But Jed called it for the ayes.
Yes, that was a political issue.
Of course it was.
And if there are any doubtful claims on Q&A, that may well have been one of them. Let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. Now, the next question, very different subject, comes from Aisha Fuster.
Thanks, Tony. With an increased unemployment rate in Australia, are businesses such as Uber, Airtasker and delivery riders only gaining ground, whom only pay minimum wages and offer little workplace protection, only gaining ground because people are desperate for work? What is the panellists' response to this situation?
Yeah, well, Tim, I'll start with you because Airtasker is your baby. So can you answer that? I mean, the essential question is, are people who do air tasks being exploited in some way?
Well, the first thing I think that's important to note is that we're talking about a whole type of work. So there's been this umbrella term being used, which is the gig economy. And I think if you kind of look at the gig economy as this
Just explain what that means to anyone out there who doesn't understand it.
Well, I think people are referring to work which is incremental. So based on a result,
you do a gig.
A payment is made, a gig, yeah. So I don't particularly like that term because I think it's a very overarching term which actually generalises what is actually a really broad and complex set of work. And on one side you have models like Airtasker, which are an open marketplace. And what I mean by that is that price and scope of jobs is determined by the people in the community. And that's very different to something like an Uber or Deliveroo, which is much more of an agency model where the price and the scope of the jobs are sort of determined by the platforms themselves. So I think the first thing is you have to differentiate between the economic paradigms that actually exist in these different kinds of platforms. But what I would say is really important about all of these kinds of platforms is that they actually leverage a resource which is being underused at the moment. So in some cases, people use words like casualising work. And I would say that, again, in some platforms that may be true. But specifically in the case of marketplaces like Airtasker, we're not talking about taking something which was previously full-time and casualising that into something which is less than that. We're actually creating a steady function which increases from there not being an opportunity at all up to something which could be possibly a full-time job in the future. So take, for example, a task like removing a drone from a tree. You know, this is not something that can easily be turned into a full-time job. You know, if you had to say, I'm a full-time drone retrieval expert, I think it's going to be really, really hard. And I think that if you, however, platforms like Airtasker facilitate that to go from nothing to becoming a job. And
Tim, what about a tougher one like removing asbestos from a house or from pipes in a house?
Well, the first thing I'd say there is, again, taking an open marketplace, a platform approach. the rules don't change when you use Airtasker. All of the same rules apply. If you need to have an asbestos license, whether you find a contractor, through email, whether you find them through Google, whether you find them or through your telephone or through a friend, the same rules apply, whether you're using the internet. It's kind of like we're going back through this same thing again, where we're trying to say, oh, the internet's different. The internet's, it's changing this whole paradigm, and that's not actually true. I mean, if we wanted to ensure that people were, when they were contacting people through Google, actually had asbestos licenses, we could track their internet, we could track their email, we could survey their phones and make sure that those asbestos licensing was being enforced. But I don't think people want that. They don't want.
Can I just ask you? I'll bring in the other panellists in a moment, but I'm intrigued by this because it's a whole new way of doing work. And there are things which are different. So you've got a company, and a lot of people work, or a number of people work in 30 or 40 in Sydney, and some in Manila. Those people that work for you in the company basically organising things, do they work under normal conditions where they get superannuation and they get overtime if they work different hours and they get all the various entitlements that normal workers get?
Absolutely. So the first thing to say is that I think into the future there's absolutely going to be multiple paradigms of work. So I don't envision a future where everything shifts into being work that's broken down into incremental units. I absolutely think there are some job types which it makes complete sense to be a full-time job. If your job is to manage something or to make sure that something's being looked after over a period of time.
But the point is it's different. I mean, the entitlements that your full-time workers get who work in your office are different than what the people who do the tasks and get paid for that work get, because they have no protections.
Yes, but I think that's an acknowledgement that in the labour force generally there's different ways that you can work. One way is full-time and another way is independent contracting.
Okay, Jed Kearney.
I think there's no doubt that the technology is amazing and is wonderful and can be used really, really well. And for a lot of people, it is a great thing if you are a qualified tradie, notwithstanding the concerns we've heard about asbestos removal, where there's cowboy tradies out there putting themselves on the platforms. That is a big concern. But really what we are seeing is, you're saying, the very amusing thing of, what was it, the removal? What do you get, the drone?
A drone removed from a tree.
That's one thing. But we are seeing areas like the NDIS where carers are being, there's platforms for carers. So if you need someone to come into your home, you can get someone on these platforms. Now, you don't know what they're being paid. You don't know what their qualifications are. You don't know if they're walking into a safe environment. You don't know if they've had all their proper checks and things like that. And, it does in many ways undermine good, steady, full-time jobs, where before people who did those jobs would have an employer, would be getting superannuation, would be getting the wages they deserve. And I do think there's a danger that it is feeding into this whole new work situation of insecure work, where people's lives are anxious.
Let's let Tim respond to that.
I think what you're speaking about there absolutely is true. There is a changing paradigm that's being created, and I think it's a really empowering one, in which we're actually democratising the way that people can either create work for others or complete work for others in order to earn money. That's a changing paradigm in the same way that the media has changed from these big masthead publications which owned the media channel. We're now saying that's democratised. Equally, that's happening inside jobs. So I think there is an important role, and I think we've worked with unions in New South Wales, we've worked with a lot of unions and regulators to implement what we think is even more important than legislation and enforcement, but is education for the wider population. Because I think that as we democratise these jobs, we're all going to have to take more responsibility in our local communities for creating great work for other people.
Tim, I'm just going to pause you both there because we haven't heard from the other side of the panel. I'd just like to hear a view from Monica and Rod about this really quite fundamental change that's going on, and it's happening while we're sort of watching, but almost too quickly for us to do anything about.
Yeah, absolutely. And back to, I think, one of Isha's seemingly key concerns was about the vulnerability of the workers involved. And while Airtasker and Uber and other temporary jobs like that enable people with the flexibility to find work where they might not be able to hold down a full-time job or a part-time job because of their circumstances, there is also that real lack of stability. We've got a housing crisis, youth homelessness that isn't helped by insecure work. You can't build an economy, you can't build stable families, stable communities on these types of temporary tasks. So it's
you can't turn the clock back either, because the gig economy is moving faster than we can actually really take into account.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're going to have to do something about it. There are these risks, and we really need to have to think about it and find ways where we can provide that stability to people, even if they're engaging in gig economy type of work.
Rod.
Well, I can hear Jed talking about as a sort of good old union workers' rights kind of stuff. But I think what I hear in the conversation is us grappling with the paradigm shift in what work really means now. I mean, the workers' rights idea was all about our right to have a stable job, perhaps pay off a mortgage, retire, whereas millennials probably will never buy a house, probably will never retire. And so there's a huge shift that we are really struggling to ethically to catch up with, and so the work that Tim's doing is really important. But I'd want to hear a shift in the advocates for workers' rights and sort of come into the 21st century and try and work out what that really means.
Just got another question to go to on the same subject, and we'll come to Jim after that. Craig Harris.
Thanks, Tony. We know that the gig economy well extends beyond the likes of Airtasker and Uber. The Australian workforce are increasingly working how they want, when they want. What doesn't seem to be catching up is a complex system of Fair Work awards. So it's near impossible to expect a small business owner to interpret and to ensure they're compliant. So why isn't the government focusing on finding solutions to help small businesses succeed?
Just a quick one before I move on. Craig, are you in this business as well?
I am indeed, yeah. So I'm part of a company called Deputy that delivers workforce management solutions to small business in particular, as well as large. But what we find is lots of businesses aren't even aware there are solutions out there.
So you want the work laws to change?
No, I guess what we want to do, we provide solutions that simplify that. But there's a real distinct lack of awareness out there across small business that solutions like us exist.
Okay, Jim.
And that's a real problem. But of course, we go back to the Fair Work as long as we know what the rules are, and people like you can help people to find those things. We have some hope. But I'd go back to what Tim was saying before, and there's a great deal of choice now available in how we work, the kind of work that we do. And Jed spoke about good, steady, full-time jobs, and that we don't want insecure work. Well, I just would like to put in a plug for the fact that since 2013, the coalitioners under the coalition, you good people have created 1 million jobs out there. 1 million jobs. Someone out there is working. Now, 400,000 of those jobs plus came this year, and we always say, to emphasise it, 1,100 jobs are being created per day. So. And I forget whether it's 3/4 or 2/3 are full-time jobs. So, insecure work, none of us want insecure work, but we want choice in what Tim's offering. There are rules that are already surround that. Just because you're working the way Tim is facilitating, you can't go out and remove asbestos, or the police will have a good talk to you.
What about workplace laws? Should they be changed at all to accommodate these new forms of workers?
Perhaps, but like all rules, they apply to people who are working on the internet, or people who get their direction from the internet, or get the gig from the internet.
So, Tim, just going back to the question that was just asked, do you think laws need to change?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there is a changing paradigm shift in the way people are working. I think underlyingly what's really important is the same laws apply whether you're working on Airtasker, whether you're working through an app, or whether you're working in any other kind of traditional method. A couple of steps that we've taken to try and create some of this security is, for example, creating public liability insurance, which is paid on an incremental basis, on a per task basis. We recently rolled out our personal accident insurance so that if a person is injured whilst doing a task, they're protected from that too. But I think there's a lot more that we have to do to
actually... Could you do superannuation, for example?
Yeah, for sure. Like helping people to save money for their retirement. Again, needs to be solved within the context of the new paradigm. not by kind of taking what is applicable to the traditional type of full-time permanent work and trying to stuff that into this new paradigm. So, for example, things like home loans. Right now, they're really structured so that it's all about, show us a pay slip, show us a full-time way of working, and I think that's completely changing. So I think it's absolutely that the rest of the ecosystem, including legislation, including finance services, etc., need to catch up with where the flexible working economy is going.
So, Jed, does that mean the unions have to sort of get on board? And a Labor government, for example, now representing many different types of workers. I mean, not just people who are in unions, but people who aren't, people who are working for themselves, and people who are working through these kind of gig economy outlets.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I acknowledge that, Tim, you've done a lot of good work with the unions, working around, I believe there's minimum rates.
We absolutely educate people about how to think about what they should be paying for a job.
Okay, and the insurance, etc. And I acknowledge that. And Labor does have a Senate inquiry right now that we initiated into the future of work and what problems are being created by these, because there are big problems. I kind of disagree with Tim in that it's empowering. It actually makes people's lives incredibly anxious. Not to know if you're going to have work next week, not to know if you can pay the rent next week, not to know, how many shifts you're going to have. It does. What we hear back from people is it makes people's lives very anxious.
Now, Tim wants to respond to that. I'll let him do that and then come back to you.
And then I want to come back to unions adapting.
Yep, go ahead.
For sure. In terms of insecurity there, you mentioned that people feel really anxious about losing their job. I would actually argue that the main reason why people are anxious about losing their current full-time job is because it's very difficult to get into work. And one of the significant reasons that it's difficult...
Not according to Jim, 1 million new jobs created.
Well, I think we've done a good job so far there, but if you look at it anecdotal and at an individual level, the reason there's anxiousness is because when you lose your job, which can happen at any time if you're made redundant, I've been made redundant before, if you lose your job, it's hard to get back into a job. And what Airtasker actually does there is it smooths your way down too. So if you are unfortunate and you lose your full-time job, you actually should be less anxious because now there's actually a way to cushion that fall and ensure that you have ongoing ways of making money. And it's not a binary outcome of you're either protected and safe and secure or you're out on the streets and it's going to be incredibly difficult to find a new role.
That could be true, but there's also the intersection that a lot of the jobs that I could go out and get, employers are now getting on Airtasker or on these platforms. For example, admin staff. Where once they would employ an admin person, they can now get someone, on a piece rate.
I would argue that a lot of people, if the choice is 0 or 1, they're going to take 0 in many, many, many of those cases. So there's actually a lot of work which just never synthesises into a job or into an earning opportunity for a person.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to close it down there. Yes, you can make your final point.
Unions are adapting. Unions are talking to Tim. We have a wonderful new union called Hospo Voice, which is helping people in the in the hospitality industry. It's fantastic. I'd like to give that a plug. If you are in the hospitality industry, join Hospo Voice. And we are working with the Labor government. We hope that a future Labor government would work with us around principles on this, making sure that there are good wages and...
Don't measure the curtain. No, I'm actually going to give you the last word. So we actually have to some political balance out of this guy. Some political balance. I guess we do live for choice. It's what the Liberal Party is all about, individuals and choice. We face, going into the future, an extraordinary choice between a budget which we have put out, which balances practicality and coalition interests, and a reply from Labor who gave everyone absolutely everything. Please don't measure the curtains yet. There's a long way to run in this. We have delivered and delivered and delivered, and we will keep delivering. All right, it's curtains for us, I'm afraid. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Monica Doumit, Rod Bauer, Jim Molan, Jed Kearney and Tim Fung. Thank you very much. Now, you can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by the CEO of Geek Girl Academy, Sarah Moran. Now, next Monday, Q&A will be live from Melbourne with the Minister for Social Services, Dan Tehan, the Shadow Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, Workplace Relations Commentator and Consultant, Grace Collier, and former Tasmanian Senator, Jackie Lambie. Until next Monday, good night.